Most, if not all, video games are bad. Allow me to set the stage for this one. The thumbnail I am putting on screen right now is for a video that came out a few months ago, with the express purpose of dragging a popular YouTube creator through the mud. No other reason whatsoever. It is an entirely inflammatory response to Egoraptor's critically acclaimed sequelitis video about The Legend of Zelda. That sequelitis video is one of my favorite videos of all time. Not because I watch Egoraptor very often, if at all these days, and not because of any opinions I simply do not have about The Legend of Zelda, because that is a series I personally skipped growing up. The reason I love that video is because it gives greater context to the problem with games as an industry. Think about how the industry really hit the mainstream in the 90s. The Dreamcast, the N64, the PlayStation 1, and handhelds like the Game Boy Color. In those days, the technical limitations meant developers had to be very creative with the nuances of each game. Emphasis on art style rather than on graphics, emphasis on sound design rather than audio fidelity, emphasis on storytelling and story sequencing rather than raw gameplay experience. The games that did well would survive to become franchises, and ultimately get those technological upgrades to solidify whatever initial intent the developers had in making those games in the first place. The ones that did poorly simply became forgotten. Just as an example, old school Mega Man had new IP made for it as far forward as 2018. The Mega Man X series died a slow, painful death after X8 in 2004. And not even the Maverick Hunter PSP reboot, nor the next-gen Legacy collections could save it. Oh, and don't get me started on Mega Man Legends. Even in the racing genre, there are franchises that are simply gone. Remember Burnout? Gone, and not even its remaster could breathe new life into it. The Dangerous Driving franchise, let's be honest, is a shadow of what Burnout used to be. And then there's Midnight Club, which faded into obscurity after MCLA. What bothers me is we are now in the 10th generation of home console. Nintendo is making their Switch 2. Sony is working on a PlayStation 6. And Microsoft has pretty much turned your smart toaster into an Xbox. From a developer standpoint, it has never been easier to create a game exactly to the specifications you wish that game to have. The technology is there, and the intellectual side of IP rests entirely on you. So if it turns out that you learned absolutely nothing from the first games you ever released, don't be surprised when you run your own franchise into the ground. And it doesn't matter what series it is. Anything from Sonic the Hedgehog, to Lara Croft, to Fallout, to Far Cry, to Need for Speed, to industry behemoths like Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. If you learn nothing, then you will never improve. The reason gamers judge modern games based on their originals is not because the originals were somehow better, but because the originals had a different benchmark. We accepted the limitations of older games with the fundamental understanding that those IPs were a work in progress and would continue to iterate on the formulas over time, that those games would grow up with us. Yet that did not always happen. And if it wasn't obvious, the only way to be exempt from this is if something is your first game in a franchise that has room to grow. The criticisms will likely be a lot more sympathetic to your situation. Though again, failure to learn from them means you will eventually fail. Also, do not get that twisted. Ship a broken game at first launch, and you will fail by default. Looking at you, Star Trucker. Alright, so that paints a somewhat generalized picture of the responsibilities a developer has to refine their games with every new iteration. So how do they do that? What is a developer supposed to look for in an objective criticism of the faults of their game? While the list may vary, here are the things I look for when I tear these games literally apart. Number 1, is there a formula? Basically, can you condense the technical workings of your game into a series of replicable inputs and outputs? For example, if I am playing a racing game and I tune a car to a particular handling setup, is it always going to handle the same way when subjected to the same road conditions? That answer sure as hell had better be yes. I've said this before, but if a car oversteers 1 minute and understeers the next, then the game does have some issues it really needs to work out. It is not the responsibility of the player to spend hours fiddling with a tune, or worse, being told to download a tuning setup for the car off the internet in order to make the game playable. Alternately, playing a stealth shooter and entering a room full of enemies. Is there a consistent movement pattern to them each time you spawn in? Or is that arrangement so completely random that the player can never predict what the enemy is going to do? There is nothing more frustrating to a player than going into a room with one attack strategy, dying, swapping to another strategy, and being rudely informed that their original strategy would have worked just that one time. Number 2, does the game both teach the player and prompt the player appropriately? A game needs to teach you inside of the game how various functions work and not expect you to go to a wiki in order to figure it out. This is even more critical if prior games in the series did things completely different. Consider something like drifting mechanics across the Need for Speed series. Every single game in the series has done drifting differently. Underground 2 did it different from Carbon, which did it different from Pro Street, which did it different from Payback, which did it different from Heat. The player is forced to completely relearn a skill they perfected in a prior game simply because that skill no longer applies. And sometimes it can be something as bullshit as just flipping the controls of a game. For example, Mafia and Mafia 2 had their own controller setups unique to those games. Mafia 3 reverses the controls entirely to make the game more like GTA. You, as the player, have to force yourself to forget the muscle memory of those games in order to play the current one. How is that okay? Not to mention that even when you've relearned those mechanics, it is all moot if the game doesn't give you the proper notice and timing to implement them. QuickTime events are an obvious criticism here, but even more subtle things like inputs getting eaten if your character gets stunlocked are a special brand of bullshit that is inexcusable, in my personal opinion. Number 3, are you wasting the player's time? If the player cannot advance through the story without completion of a particular arbitrary benchmark, then that is bad design. Anything from a mandatory minimum level to having particular items in your inventory, to beating a very specific subset of enemies, to literal Konami code levels of cryptic puzzle solving. I have spoken numerous times about how less than 10% of people beat the games they play. In an ideal world, that number would be closer to 50%. I'ma put it out there. Ubisoft's decision in Far Cry 6 to change easy mode to story mode is a step in the right direction. Why? Because it does not penalize the player for wanting to just enjoy the story and feel rewarded for sticking with it for 50 hours and hitting that roll credits. And they can basically New Game Plus on a harder difficulty if they so choose. More games need to do that. That said, the biggest bullshit and biggest time waste that completely ruins a game for me is if you as the player fail a mission multiple times, and when you finally beat that mission, the story is literally coded for the player's failure anyway. Like, if you die 20 times in the level, get to the end, and your character is killed off anyway, at that point, you should have just moved the story along after the player had died like 3 times. Do not waste the player's time. Number 4, am I going to keep playing this after the credits roll? If I return to the title screen and my first instinct is to quit, open settings and hit uninstall, you have failed as a developer. I should feel a desire, as the player, to go back into your game world and strive for more. Whether that is getting higher scores, or collecting achievements, or even just breaking your game for fun and profit, if I don't feel that drive, you have failed. One of the worst plagues of modern gaming is this idea that multiplayer and PvP can make up for the sinking ship that is a failed single-player experience. Like, NFS Unbound is the prime fucking example of this. Its online mode has gotten patch after patch after patch after patch, optimizations and improvements, but none of that fixes how terrible the single-player experience is. Meanwhile, I can go back to Rivals at any time and the game is always going to feel just a little bit fresh because it is a game where you jump in, cause mayhem, and jump out all completely at your leisure. Just saying. And the last one, number 5. Does the player's outlook change after playing your game? As in, you presented them with a story and concepts and things that, if done well, the player is going to want to carry those concepts into how they play future games. It is going to drive their preferences and ultimately the future games that they play. Yakuza Like a Dragon, for example, is in itself a phenomenal game. The turn-based combat is incredible, the overall presentation is hilarious when it wants to be, and tragic when it needs to be. It is a 50-hour adventure that you will grow to love up until the point it completely overstays its welcome. Because what that game ultimately did wrong is tell the player that their actions will never have a true resolution. You will be dragged along indefinitely for as long as the developers want you to be dragged along, regardless of how you feel about it. Okay, let's review. In summation, good games do the following: consistent formulas, teaching and prompting, not wasting a player's time, encouraging post-game playthrough, and incentivizing the player to play more games of that particular genre. This is not a particularly difficult set of questions to answer. And yet, the bulk of game developers will get at least one of these things wrong, and they'll just never fix it. And that is why games get worse over time. Because again, those problems likely were in the original games that we all get nostalgic for. It's just that we were more forgiving the first time it happened than we are the 5th time it happens. Do you genuinely know why NFS Most Wanted 05 is so popular? It's because it did everything that NFS High Stakes did first. High Stakes did pink slips first, but it was a lot more unforgiving. No restarts. If you lose, your car is gone. End of story. In Most Wanted, you literally had to ignore all of the failsafes put into the game to truly lose your car and game over. EA Black Box learned from what was done in prior games of the NFS franchise to make truly the best game that they could. And learning just seemed to fall out of favor industry-wide as time went on. This is not helped by the fact that gamers will make excuses for their favorite franchises. Face the fact that you had to put up with the bullshit in order to get where you are. And now that you're good at the game, you argue to everybody else that the game was always fine and they just aren't disciplined enough. which is bullshit. It is not a skill issue. It is your own cognitive dissonance because you don't want to admit a game needs fixing. Why else would you personally modify a game? Literally changing the developer's IP to address the things you think are wrong with it. What level of hypocrisy is that? Face it, most games are bad. They fail to meet their own objectives from a design standpoint, and they put the player through conditions that stop being fun the further into the games a player gets. They are bad. And you know what? That's okay. If there is one thing I want people to take away from this video, it is that even a bad game can deserve to be bought, to be played, and to be beaten. I hate Forza Horizon 4. I have 100 hours in it. I hate Monster Hunter World. I have over 200 hours in it as of this discussion. Finding faults in a game should never make it a deal breaker. Quite the opposite. Finding faults in a game should create a discussion for how the developers can make the next game better. That is what Egoraptor was trying to do. And that is what I try to do on my channel. Every time I roll credits of a game on my channel, I spare no expense criticizing the hell out of it. It is my hope that if the devs ever see my criticisms, they take that into consideration when preparing the next game. Because if they make those changes, I will buy the next game. But if they won't make those changes, why should I? Like, I loved Far Cry 4, I hated Far Cry 5, and I loved Far Cry 6. Because issues I had with Far Cry 5 were addressed in Far Cry 6. Not because it's anything like Far Cry 4, mind you. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Gamers should always be critical of the games they play. No exceptions. No game should ever be a perfect 10. Because if it was, then the series should end. If a game literally needs no improvement, why make a new one? It is mind-boggling to me. Game reviews these days overinflate what a game actually is and fail to genuinely tear the game apart for fear that they will not get coverage of those games anymore. In my opinion, that is a disservice to the developers because they stop improving on a professional level. And gamers really do need to understand this too. By white knighting your favorite game, you are telling the developers that you don't want them to be better. You want them to stagnate in what they have already done. And in most cases, you are lying to them outright. Because again, you do find faults in your favorite games. You just don't want to admit it. So that's really where I am with all this. I am a gaming YouTuber because I love playing games. And when a game frustrates me, I feel incentivized to understand the process better in hopes that the next time around, it will capture my attention for that much longer. At some point, I likely will beat NFS Unbound, and at some point, I likely will play Forza Horizon 5, and I am already playing Monster Hunter Rise. I can hate these games, on principle or otherwise, and still find something in them that speaks to me as a player, and that is really all I need. So if you listened to me ramble about all this, just take a moment to understand where I'm coming from, where Egoraptor was coming from, and just where developers need to explore next if they want to continue improving on gaming. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.